Today I'm out here with two of the hottest new cars in America. We have the Toyota RAV4 Hybrid right over here, and then on this side we have the Honda CR-V Hybrid, the hotly anticipated CR-V Hybrid, I might add. Both of these vehicles will get you nearly 40 miles per gallon, and these are two of the best-selling things in America that aren't trucks. If you're taking a look at the top sales chart, RAV4 is #1 outside the truck segment, and CR-V is #2. The electric Smurf RAV4 right here is our long-term RAV4 hybrid tester. This is the one that we bought here at Alex & Autos. You can see that we have full LED headlamps up front. These are projector-style LED headlamps, not reflectors like we find in the CR-V. And there are a few different front-end looks. This is the XLE trim version of the RAV4 hybrid. There's also an SE and XSE version as well. Over here in the CR-V, you can see that things are a little bit differently styled. We have reflector LED headlamps, not projector LED headlamps. Now, LED headlights are standard on the CR-V hybrid, but they're not standard on the corresponding non-hybrid CR-V models. I think that the front-end look of the RAV4 is a little bit more modern looking and a little bit more aggressive, but the CR-V is attractive in its own right. We have LED fog lamps down here at the bottom that I think are a little bit better looking than the round ones that we find over here in the RAV4. Honda and Toyota have really been responsible for pushing the industry forward when it comes to active safety, because both Toyota and Honda decided a number of years ago that they were going to make the vast majority of their active safety technologies standard on nearly every vehicle in their lineups, and these two vehicles are no exception. We have their raft of active safety technologies standard on both models, but there are some slight variances. Radar adaptive cruise control, lane keeping assistance, autonomous braking, all that is standard on both of these models. Blind spot monitoring is optional on both of them. That is a feature that I really wish was standard because it is very handy. We also have parking sensors available front and rear over here on the RAV4, and that's going to cost you a little bit less than getting parking sensors over here on the CR-V. And this top end trim does have both front and rear parking sensors. In terms of operation, I find the Toyota system to be a little bit smoother than the radar adaptive cruise control over here in the Honda, but Honda's lane centering system is a little bit smoother and a little bit more aggressive at keeping you in the center of the lane. So this does end up being more of a personal preference than anything. It's worth noting that collision mitigating braking, which is what Honda calls their autonomous braking system, is really aggressive out on the highway. So if you're driving aggressively, this system is much more likely to slam on the brakes for you. The new RAV4 is a little bit shorter than the current CR-V. Remember that the RAV4 was all new for 2019, but the CR-V has been on sale for a while, and that's why some of the design elements do look a little bit older. At 180.9 inches long, this is sort of in the middle of the compact CR-V segment. You will find some smaller compact crossovers like the Hyundai Tucson or the Kia Sportage, but you'll also find some longer models like the upcoming Nissan Rogue. Back here you can see that Toyota has definitely decided to give this more of an aggressive crossover style than it had before. That's also visible up front. They decided they wanted to make the RAV4 look a little bit more truck-like, and that's why this generation is significantly higher off the ground than the previous model. Some folks I've talked to think that the CR-V looks a little bit minivan-like. It may have to do with the sort of bubbly shape back here, but again, remember, this is not quite as modern of a design. And Honda also seems to be going to more of an angular theme, so when the CR-V gets a complete redesign, I expect it's going to change a little bit. The wheelbase is a little bit shorter on this generation CR-V than it is on the RAV4, but interestingly enough, we get more room on the inside, and of course, more cargo room in the non-hybrid model because of the overall length. The CR-V is a little bit longer than the RAV. When it comes to ground clearance, the two models are pretty similar. The CR-V wins by a hair at 8.2 inches of ground clearance. The RAV4 Hybrid comes in at 8.1 inches of clearance. This is the lowest version of the RAV4 currently sold in America. The RAV4 Prime may be just a hair lower. We aren't going to talk too much about that plug-in hybrid version of the RAV4 because there are a lot of details that we cannot talk about just yet. But be sure and stay tuned for that video because I will have a full RAV4 Prime video coming up very, very soon. As you can see, the CR-V has a slightly flatter rear end, a little bit more vertical, and this is part of why some people have said this sort of looks like a small minivan. Whereas over here in the RAV4, we definitely have more of an Angry Bird style going on with these tail lamp modules. They stick out a little bit more than we find in the CR-V. These kind of remind me of upside down question marks, actually. Under the hood, we have two very different hybrid systems. The Toyota hybrid system over here is based around a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder naturally aspirated engine. The engine produces 176 horsepower in its own right, and the collective system horsepower is 219. This gives you 40 miles per gallon combined, 41 in the city, 38 on the highway. But the big thing to know about this hybrid system is that it does not have a mechanical all-wheel drive system. Even though all-wheel drive is standard in the RAV4 Hybrid at the moment, it's e-all-wheel drive, and that means that there is a separate electric motor in the back. That produces 54 horsepower and 89 pound-feet of torque. You'll notice that that is not nearly as much power as this entire system can put out collectively. And things are quite different over here under the hood of the CR-V. In the CR-V, we have a 2-liter naturally aspirated engine, so smaller than we find in the RAV4. It produces less power as well, 143 horsepower and 129 pound-feet of torque. This system is a little bit easier to explain really than the hybrid system under the hood of the RAV4. Below about 45 miles an hour or so, this operates purely as a serial hybrid system. So there is a 180 or so horsepower electric motor that is directly connected to the wheels. You'll see the specifications there on the side of your screen. That is all that is driving the car forward under about 45 miles an hour or so. The engine will kick on now and then to generate power, send it over to that electric motor, and if more power is required than the engine and generator can produce, it pulls that power from the battery pack. That means that under most driving situations, the maximum horsepower output from this system to the front wheels is 181 horsepower. Now, this is a somewhat nuanced argument, of course, and Honda has had a little bit of pushback when we've described this system this way, but if you want to know more about how this hybrid system works, I do have a separate video on that. The Honda engineers have looked that one over, and they finally gave in that technically the description is correct. So what Honda is saying when they say 212 horsepower total, they're saying that the combined output of the engine, the motors, everything there going into the 181 horsepower electric motor has a combined total of 212 horsepower. The trouble is that that final electric motor really is your limiting factor, and that's one of the reasons that this is slower, notably, than the RAV4 Hybrid. You'll really notice that in about the 30 to 60 mile an hour range. 0 to 30 feels pretty peppy in both because we have a lot of torque out of this engine. But once you get over about 30 miles an hour or so, especially in the quarter mile times, the RAV4 is definitely going to be quicker. Now, this hybrid system is based around 2 motor generator units as well, but it uses a planetary power split system. So this system right here will be able to deliver more power to the front wheels than this system over here across a wider variety of engine speeds and vehicle speeds. That's the important thing to keep in mind. It also seems to have higher fuel efficiency at higher speeds and at very low speeds. That's one of the reasons this gets 41 in the city, beating the CR-V hybrid over here, which gets 40 miles per gallon city, and this gets 38 miles per gallon on the highway versus the 35 miles per gallon over here in the CR-V. The CR-V also comes standard with all-wheel drive, but this is a true mechanical all-wheel drive system, very much like we see in the Ford Escape Hybrid. So if you live in an area and you're really concerned about winter traction, even though Toyota has done an excellent job tuning their all-wheel drive system in this RAV4 Hybrid, you should know that generally speaking, this system is going to be more capable, and it's going to feel very different. It's going to feel more sure-footed because this system can send more power to the rear axle across a wider variety of engine and transmission speeds. So if you want to be able to send nearly 100% of engine torque to the rear axle, assuming the front wheels had zero traction, this system could do that, and the RAV4 over here could not. In addition to the mechanical all-wheel drive system, one of the reasons that fuel economy is lower in this model is the tire size. We have wider tires, 235 width tires, on all hybrid CR-V models, and the tire width and contact patch are definitely going to have an impact, especially in highway fuel economy. This is 3 miles per gallon lower on the highway than in the RAV4. Front seat comfort is a little bit better in the CR-V Hybrid. If we get the top end trims, we do have a 4-way adjustable electric lumbar support. That's something that I really wish the RAV4 had. And the seat design itself just is more comfortable for my body shape. We have a little bit more thigh support. If you're interested in a car that has more thigh support because you have longer legs, this is going to be a good option. If you have shorter legs, then that might be tricky since it is not adjustable. We have a tilt telescopic steering column with about the same range of motion that we find in the RAV4, but the passenger seat is also powered in the CR-V Hybrid in this top end trim, and it's manual in the RAV4. I'll let you refer to the headroom and legroom charts on the side of your screen, but you should know that the front seats are pretty comparable in terms of those numbers, RAV4 to CR-V, but the CR-V has an awful lot more rear legroom and more combined legroom than we find in the RAV4. You can see I have about 7 or 8 inches of legroom left. That means that if you plan on putting a rear-facing child seat in your compact crossover and you want a hybrid, this is going to be more accommodating than the RAV4. If you're installing a rear-facing child seat in a car, you don't want that child seat to be hitting the front seat backs. There should be a decent amount of room between the two. That's one of the most common mistakes I see when people are installing child seats. So if you want to put an adult up front and a child seat in the back, keep that in mind. Moving over to the other side, this front seat back is all the way back in its tracks. You can see I still have about 4 or 5 inches of legroom left. We have a little bit more headroom back here in this model as well versus the top end trim of the RAV4 Hybrid, which we're not going to look at because that one has a panoramic moonroof and this one just has a standard sized moonroof. So overall, I have about 1.5 inches or 2 of headroom left. A nice touch is that the back seat in the CR-V folds completely flat with the cargo area in the rear rather than being up at the end, sort of like a little ramp. A key difference between the back seats in the RAV4 and CR-V is that the RAV4's seatbelt comes out of the seat itself, not out of the ceiling. There are 2 big reasons that I like this seat design. If you have a child seat latched into the center, the seat is going to be more in the center of the seat, might be skewed to one side because of that roof anchor position. And the second reason is cargo practicality. You have that big bump there in the rear ceiling where that seat belt is mounted. We don't find that over here in the RAV4. We also have a rear seat back that is still 60-40 split. However, the 40 side is over here on the driver's side, the 60 is over here on the passenger side, and it does not go as flat or as close to the ground as we find in the CR-V. That means that the distance between the ceiling and the rear seat back is a little bit more over here in the RAV4. But that's because the RAV4 Hybrid puts its battery pack right here under the rear seats. And since this is my hybrid, we can actually take a look at it without feeling bad. These rear seats pop up right like that, and then we find the battery pack right here under the rear seats. That really pays dividends when it comes to cargo capacity. The battery placement means that in the RAV4's cargo area, we find exactly the same amount of cargo space in the hybrid and the non-hybrid, 37.6 cubic feet. The CR-V's cargo area is a little bit larger in the non-hybrid model at 39.2 cubic feet, but if you get the hybrid, that drops down to below what we find over here in the RAV4 at 33.2. And the RAV4 Hybrid has another trick up its sleeve, and this is particularly impressive when we take a look at the upcoming plug-in hybrid, the RAV4 Prime. We have a spare tire under the cargo area load floor. And as you can see in my model, there is enough room for a full-size spare because I put one in there myself aftermarket. Now, if you were to use the donut spare that comes with the car, the load floor would go down another about 2.5 inches or so, giving you that maximum of 37.6 cubic feet of storage space. Technically, in my RAV4, with the full-size spare tire right there, this ends up somewhere around 34 or 35 cubic feet, basically the same that we find in the RAV4 Prime. And the RAV4 Prime, again, still has a spare tire. Over here in the CR-V, we have 33.2 cubic feet of storage space, and if we lift up the load floor, we find nothing. And that's because the battery pack, if I can lift this up the rest of the way here, there are little clips here so I can do that. You find the battery pack right there at the back end of the cargo area. That's because, quite logically, this was not originally designed for the hybrid system. The hybrid system came after the CR-V was designed. Now, in kind of an unusual twist, we have this enormous insert right here, and down at the very bottom of this well, there's a lot of unused space here. This says tire repair kit storage only for some reason. Not sure why we have such a big blank for that. In terms of cargo hatch clearance, it seems to be pretty equal. I have about 1 inch over there, and then moving over here to the RAV4, about the same inch or so. So the extra kink over here in the RAV4's design does not affect cargo capacity. On the inside, the design of the CR-V feels a little bit more grown up, but perhaps not quite as modern as what we find in the RAV4. A lot of folks out there say that they dislike this imitation wood trim, but personally I don't mind it. I think it looks relatively believable in here, and I like the styles and the shape going on in this dashboard. Unfortunately, when we get to the center of the dashboard, the infotainment system does feel behind the times. Not only is this screen smaller than the one in the RAV4, it is definitely more sluggish, and its interaction with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto is a little bit tricky. This particular system, I've noticed, has had problems pairing with Apple CarPlay, and reliability-wise, Apple CarPlay sometimes goes offline. We've noticed exactly the same thing in our limited tests of Android Auto as well. This is not as modern as the infotainment system that we find in the RAV4, and it appears that the processor is not quite as snappy either. You'll really notice that moving around the system, it just doesn't feel quite as snappy as the RAV4 system. Below the screen, we have controls for the heated seats. No ventilated seats are available in here. The electric parking brake here, auto brake hold, and then a push-button shifter. Some folks really dislike this, but I think that most people will get used to it. My big thing with this push-button design is that it doesn't end up really saving any room versus a traditional shifter. We have park there, reverse is a button that pulls back that way, neutral, drive right there, and then right back to park. Continuing down from there, we have 2 USB ports. This one interfaces with the smartphone integration, that's why we have a little smartphone icon there, USB charge-only port, a Qi wireless charging mat right there, 2 large cup holders. One nice touch is that if you do spill your soda here, there's nowhere for that soda to really go other than this wireless charging mat, which does appear to be well sealed. There's a two-stage divider. It slides forward and backward like that, and then will tilt up out of the way, giving you access to this complete area. You can see that you could fit some larger items in there, although I was not able to fit a gallon of milk. It was pretty darn close. The CR-V's instrument cluster is a large LCD right here in the middle. Then we have some digital gauges on either side. These are LED gauges for the battery level and the fuel gauge over there on the right. The steering wheel is similar to other Honda models. We have regen paddles on the back, which is a really nice touch that I like. Up on the right, down on the left. There's no adjustable regen in the RAV4. We'll talk about these more in the drive section, but these allow you to adjust throttle lift-off regen. On the left side of the steering wheel, we find controls for the infotainment system, and then on the right side, we have the controls for the standard radar adaptive cruise control and a steering wheel heater button. Out on the road, these two hybrid systems feel quite different. The hybrid system that we find in the Honda feels a little bit more like an EV, albeit not a terribly powerful EV. So this doesn't feel like a Tesla. This feels a little bit more like a Nissan Leaf, perhaps. We have that 180 horsepower electric motor, and that is all that is driving you forward at speeds below 45 miles an hour. So quite logically, this really is an EV below 45 miles an hour, just happens to be backed by a gasoline engine rather than a big battery pack. And things in the RAV4 Hybrid are a little bit different. That feels a little bit more like a car with the traditional CVT, even though it does not have a CVT in the traditional sense. It's just due to the way that hybrid drivetrain is designed. Now, the RAV4 has more power according to Toyota, and in our 0 to 60 tests, it is certainly faster. 7.5 seconds 0 to 60 versus 7.8 for this CR-V. That's because we have less power in the CR-V effectively. Again, 180 horsepower electric motor to the wheels. That large electric motor gives us a lot of torque initially, so this feels pretty peppy in city driving, but in 0 to 60 runs you are going to notice the difference, and that difference is going to widen the faster you go. So for instance, in the quarter mile, which we don't normally talk about here at Alex Autos, but to prove the point, we did one in both of these vehicles. The RAV4, 15.6 seconds at 92 miles an hour. The CR-V Hybrid, 16.4 seconds at 83 miles an hour. That's a pretty big difference. Surprisingly, curb weight is nearly identical between these two vehicles. I had expected the Toyota to be a little bit lighter because of its e-all-wheel drive system, but the e-all-wheel drive system apparently is more about fuel economy and packaging efficiency than overall weight savings. When we tested stopping distance, the CR-V took 120 feet to stop from 60 miles an hour back to zero. It's a pretty good score for a compact crossover. The RAV4 Hybrid, 129. Now, part of that is because the CR-V does have wider tires, 235 versus 225 with tires in the RAV4, but I think part of that also has to do with the way the braking system is designed. The blended braking system that we find in the CR-V has a much better feel to it than we find in the Toyota. This feels more refined. The transitions between regen braking and friction braking and transitions between mild braking and aggressive braking are definitely smoother in the Honda system than we find in the Toyota system. That may play some role in the stopping distance. Unfortunately, when it comes to handling, the wider tires don't help out the CR-V as much as I had thought, and that's due to the suspension tuning. The CR-V is just a little bit softer out on the road. This wallows a bit more in the corners. We have a little bit more tip and dive, a little bit more body roll. This doesn't feel quite as on center as the RAV4. That shouldn't be too surprising. The CR-V is the older vehicle here, and the RAV4 was brand new for 2019. Ride quality is definitely a win for the CR-V. Out on a rougher gravel road like we're on here, you can certainly feel fewer of the larger or smaller imperfections in this cabin than we do in the RAV4. The RAV4 suspension is just tuned a little bit firmer, a little bit more for on-road driving. Clearly, both vehicles have over 8 inches of ground clearance, which is suitable for mild off-roading if you're going down a trail. So if you're going to that national park and you want to be able to go down some of those paths to the campsites, neither of these vehicles is going to have a problem. Ground clearance is one of the bigger factors there. But if you're going to be spending hours and hours on rough road surfaces, the CR-V is going to be more comfortable in those situations. The CR-V is also going to be more comfortable for longer road trips. So if you plan on heading out for 500, 600, 700 miles at a time, definitely keep that in mind. In our cabin noise test, we got 72 decibels in the RAV4 Hybrid cabin, and the CR-V was just a hair quieter, which did surprise me at 71.5. So the cabin noise win definitely goes to the CR-V. With 40 miles per gallon combined, the fuel economy win clearly goes to the RAV4. Digging a little deeper, if we get these vehicles out on the open highway at 75 miles an hour, the RAV4 is notably more fuel efficient. Now, according to the EPA, this should be getting 3 miles per gallon less than the RAV4 on the highway, but in our tests, the delta was more like 6 miles per gallon. The main reason for that is that the EPA tests are not terribly high speed. The bulk of the highway portion of the EPA test is not at 75 or 80 miles an hour. The bulk of it is down there towards 50 miles an hour. There is a portion of the EPA test that is quote-unquote high-speed highway, but it's not a very long portion. And we're just talking about steady state, level highway travel the RAV4 Hybrid is definitely going to be more efficient. That's because this hybrid system has effectively just one fixed ratio between the engine and the front wheels. It can engage that over 45 miles an hour, but that's sort of like just having fifth gear in a new car. That's not the most efficient gear to be in at higher speeds. At those higher speeds in the CR-V, we theoretically won't have as much electrical loss as we find in the RAV4 because you can completely eliminate the motors from the equation if you wanted to. The vehicle is always going to be balancing power around, though, based on driving situation and what it thinks is most efficient. But theoretically, it is possible to completely remove the motors from the equation. The RAV4 Hybrid can never do that, but it can give us mechanical ratios in an infinite spread between the engine and the front tires, and that's going to improve mechanical fuel efficiency over there. As the saying goes, your mileage will vary, but the RAV4 gets the fuel economy win here. It's simply more efficient. Now, there are still some benefits to the CR-V hybrid system. The big one is, of course, the mechanical all-wheel drive system. This feels much more sure-footed in slippery conditions, and it's going to feel a little bit more sporty sometimes out on the roads. For instance, if you're in a corner here and you just give it a little bit more gas, you don't get torque steer and you don't get front wheel slip like you can get in the RAV4 hybrid. Depending on exactly what you're doing, this may be a bit more fun, but then of course the suspension feels awfully soft, so that does reduce the fun factor just a little bit. The last time I drove the CR-V Hybrid was at the launch event for this vehicle out in Arizona. And at that time I said I might just get the CR-V Hybrid over the RAV4 for a few reasons. I think the driver's seat is a little bit more comfortable. We also get more rear seat legroom, and I like some of the design components on the dash more than the RAV4. But this time I've had a full week in the CR-V Hybrid, and comparing this to the RAV4 Hybrid, I have a feeling that I might select the RAV4 instead. The CR-V Hybrid just feels a little bit older. I love the way the drivetrain feels, but we don't get all 212 horsepower accessible to the end user really until you're going pretty darn fast. It would have to be over 100 miles an hour when the clutch pack can close and deliver full power. And that is noticeable in our 0 to 60 times, in the quarter mile times. Any of those acceleration tests, you will definitely notice the difference. Fuel economy is also lower than I had suspected. If these two vehicles are driven back to back on the same drive loop, our usual fuel economy test loop, then they're not too far off. They both get about what the EPA says they should get. But in my real-world driving situation, I drive up and over a 2,200-foot mountain pass, and in that test, there's a massive difference, and I absolutely had not expected that. I was so surprised by that I ran this on the same driving test loop again in caravan style with this RAV4 Hybrid right over here just to verify their mileage numbers, and we got exactly the same numbers that we got before. Just about 38 miles per gallon in this one, just about 40 miles per gallon in this guy right here. So not only will the CR-V Hybrid be a little bit less fuel efficient when you're driving at higher speeds, say 75 or 80 miles an hour, remember that in the US we have 85 mile an hour speed limits in Texas, those kind of higher speed situations, you're really going to notice the difference between these two vehicles, and also in hill climbing situations, and that is where this guy let us down a bit. In order to climb up that 2,200-foot mountain pass at 60 to 65 miles an hour, this engine was really screaming. It was practically floored. That was all the oomph we could get out of the vehicle. The battery was essentially drained, and all we were left with was the engine itself, and that's not a terribly efficient way to drive up a hill. Meanwhile, this RAV4 Hybrid over here, the engine produces more torque, it's a little bit larger in displacement, and in those hill climbing situations, the difference in fuel economy was nearly 15 miles per gallon. On my one-way trip to the office, this guy got over 40 miles per gallon, about 44 miles per gallon. But on the reverse of that exact same trip, driving the same way, same temperature, fuel economy dropped down to just below 20 miles per gallon. Oddly enough, during the week that we've had this CR-V Hybrid, as I said before, it's actually received slightly lower average fuel economy than the BMW 228i that we also have this week. Value is pretty comparable between these two models. The RAV4 does start a little bit more than the CR-V. The CR-V is just under $28,000. This is just over $28,000 without tax, title, or of course destination. More features are available on the RAV4 Hybrid, however, and that's why the RAV4 Hybrid gets up to a higher price tag than we find over here in the CR-V. We have features like the ventilated seats, the bigger infotainment system in the dashboard. That infotainment system is also notably more reliable and an awful lot snappier than the one that we find over here in the CR-V. I have to admit that the latest Apple OS versions have caused a few problems with Honda's infotainment systems. We've noticed that in a number of Honda vehicles that we've had lately, and this CR-V is not immune from that. We didn't have the same kind of problems over here in the RAV4, and of course we have that bigger screen as well. When I was out in Arizona, I did not have the ability to drive these two back to back on some fun, winding, curvy roads, and this week I was able to do that, and the RAV4 does feel a little bit more sprightly. I think my bottom line is that you can't go wrong with the CR-V Hybrid, and there are definitely some good reasons to get this over the RAV4. The rear seat room, the standard all-wheel drive system, but there are also some great reasons to buy the RAV4. And unless you need that rear seat room for child seats, if you're just putting adults in the back, the RAV4 will be fine. And if you live in a really snowy climate, maybe the all-wheel drive system is going to be an advantage to you, but we don't have a spare tire available like we do have in the RAV4. And again, the RAV4 can accommodate a full-size spare if you want to put one in there yourself later. And that's why I think if my money were on the line, I would probably get the RAV4 again. Although I might wait for the RAV4 Prime, because the RAV4 Prime is basically what you see here, only faster, with only the ability to have a donut spare in the trunk. That's really the only difference between the two. Be sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. And of course, check out our full review of this, the RAV4 Prime, and our full review of the Honda CR-V Hybrid for 2020 as well. Let me know what you would pick down there in the comment section below. Find us over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Instagram, all those other social things, and I'll see all of you later.